and welcome to ManchTalk. I'm Tammy Simmons. I'm your host, and I'm glad that you're taking the time to listen and join me today. As we wrap up the wonderful, wonderful summer that we've had, and those lazy days of August have turned into the early, fall days here in New Hampshire. Those of us in politics probably think of it more now. We're truly in the political season. Primary day, for those of you who aren't aware, is Tuesday, September 13th, so that's just a couple weeks away. It's at that time that you who are registered Republican or undeclared can vote in the Republican primary, or undeclared or Democrat can vote in the Democrat primary. And this is where sometimes the biggest decisions in elections are made, because this is where you decide who the candidates that are going to be in the general election that are going to go head-to-head Republican to Democrat are going to be. In this year, I know there are some third-party candidates, so, they'll be on the ballot as well in November. But for the most part, if you live in Manchester, and there's 4 wards that have primaries this year. Ward 1 has a 3-way primary for 2 seats. Ward 8 has a 3-way primary for 2 seats. And they have a primary in the Floterial. The Floterial covers wards 8, 9, and Litchfield, and there's 3 candidates for those 2 seats. So obviously Ward 9 has the same Floterial primary. Ward 10, which is where myself and Dan Garthwaite are running, we have a 3-way primary for 2 seats, and our Floterial has a 3-way primary for 2 seats, and wards 11 and 12 have that same Floterial primary for the 10, 11, 12 Floterial. So especially if you live in one of those wards and you care about what happens at the State House, please do get out and vote. In addition to the state rep races, you've got a primary on the Republican side of things anyways. There's a primary for the governor's race. There are 4 Republicans running for that nomination. There is a Senate primary in the district that Dave Booten was in. There's 2 Republicans running for that seat. There's a 3-way primary in a challenge to Donna Soucy. George Lambert, Ralph Boehm, Ross Terrio are the 3 Republicans running to be the nominee to run against Donna Soucy. Winterton and Duart and Hook are running to run against whoever the Democrat is that's running for the open seat that Booten retired from, and in the West Side we have Carla Garrick running for the seat unopposed on the Republican side to run against Lou D'Alessandro. There's also a primary in the Executive Council race where you have Joe Kelly Lavasser and Jim Adams running, and one of them would like to be the nominee to run against Chris Pappas. And then the state rep races. So please take time between now and the 13th to reach out and figure out who you're going to vote for, so that you're not just voting on a whim when you get in that ballot booth. And always remember that if you don't know anything about a candidate, if you really don't know who you should vote for, sometimes it's better if you don't vote in that particular race at all. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go and vote in other races. But enough about summer and the political season that's upon us. Today, I wanted to back that up a little bit and talk more about elections in general. And an interesting question came up over the weekend, because the Granite State taxpayers have a survey that they send out to Republican candidates. I assume they send it to Democrat candidates as well. But and one of the questions on this survey was, would you support a mandatory 30-day waiting period to be able to vote in New Hampshire? And for years now, we've been struggling in how we can address having out-of-state voters having the ability to vote legally here in New Hampshire. Generally, everybody points to students. They say, it's the UNH students, it's the Plymouth students, it's the Dartmouth students, and they blame it all on students. But it's not only students that are kind of living here and kind of living someplace else that maybe shouldn't be voting in our elections. One thing we always should remember is that the purpose of elections, because we have a representative government, is for the people within that political subdivision to vote for the people that will represent them. Not to vote for people who are going to represent somebody else. Just like I live in Manchester Ward 10, I'm going to vote for the representatives to the State House in my ward. I don't get to pick who represents Ward 8. And that just makes sense. The problem we have with out-of-state voters is, I'm going to use students as an example just because it seems to be what people follow along easiest. You might have a student who's from Michigan. They grew up in Michigan. They live at their parents' house. They're on their parents' health insurance. Their car is registered in Michigan. It's got Michigan plates. They have a Michigan driver's license. In all essence, they live in Michigan. But they're going to go to school at UNH. Does that actually mean that they are domiciled here? See, and that's the second part of this dilemma. New Hampshire has a conflict between the word domicile and the word residence. Now, our Constitution, which obviously, I'm going to read this to you, and it's going to be kind of a little dull, but I'm going to read you what the Constitution says regarding elections. All elections are to be free, and every inhabitant of the state of 18 years of age and upwards shall have an equal right to vote in any election. Every person shall be considered an inhabitant for the purpose of voting in the town, ward, or unincorporated place where he has his domicile. No person shall have the right to vote under the Constitution of this state who has been convicted of treason, bribery, or willful violation of the election laws of the state or the United States. But the Supreme Court may, on notice to the Attorney General, restore the privilege to vote to any person who may have forfeited it by conviction of such offenses. The General Court shall provide by law for voting by qualified voters who at the time of the biennial or state elections, or of the primary elections thereof, or of city elections, or of town elections by official ballots, are absent from the city or town in which they are inhabitants, or by reason of physical disability are unable to vote in person, in the choice of any officer or officers to be elected, or upon any questions submitted at such election. Voting registration and polling places shall be easily accessible to all persons, including disabled and elderly persons who are otherwise qualified to vote in the choice of any officer or officers to be elected, or upon any questions submitted at such election. The right to vote shall not be denied to any person because of the non-payment of tax. Every inhabitant of the state having the proper qualifications has an equal right to be elected into office. So, basically, the Constitution says, if you're domiciled here, you can vote. If you're 18 and older and you haven't committed one of these offenses, you have a right to vote in the state of New Hampshire. The question is, what constitutes domicile? And when it comes to elections, the law says if you have the intention of staying here. So when you have a college student or anybody else who maybe has more than one state of residence, they can certainly say, well, I intend to stay here. I mean, I could drive to New Jersey today and say, well, I intend to stay here. And then tomorrow decide, well, now I intend not to stay here. So we've got this vacancy. We've got this black hole where we allow people with the intention of staying in New Hampshire to vote, to represent the people who actually reside in New Hampshire. So every time the debate comes up over election law bills and whether we're going to require an ID, whether we're going to put a 30-day restriction, it always opens up this big can of worms, and it's not as easy to fix as it may outwardly seem. The voter ID, requiring a picture ID, that has less to do with where you live and more to do with identifying that you are actually the person you say you are. You can have an out-of-state ID. You can use other forms of identification. Just because your ID says you live in Dover doesn't mean that you can't vote in Manchester if that's where you're registered to vote. It's more to say, hey, look, I'm Tammy Simmons. Here's my ID that says I'm Tammy Simmons. I supported voter ID because there's no harm in it. There are exceptions. There are ways to do it without an ID. You can still sign an affidavit. They would set your ballot aside, and if there was a close enough race where your ballot would matter, then they would include it. But generally, there's ways. One of the concerns I've always had, and after reading that part of the Constitution to you, is you have to make sure that you're not creating what people call a poll tax. By requiring a New Hampshire driver's license specifically as a form of identification, you would be saying that you must go purchase this driver's license in order to vote. And that's not constitutional. That's a poll tax. So unless New Hampshire wants to give away all its driver's license for free, you're going to end up with people who either don't drive or can't afford to get a non-driver's ID from voting. So that's one hiccup we have. So then now back to this 30-day residency requirement. My concern with that is, say I live in Michigan. Say I am that person who lives in Michigan, and I decide I'm moving to New Hampshire. And my house closes on the 15th of October. On the 15th, I'm here. I now own property. I have a house here. I go down to DMV on the 16th. I register my car. I get my driver's license. In all instances, I am a New Hampshire resident. But because some people think we should have a 30-day waiting period to vote, that would be come November 8th. I hadn't lived here for 30 days, so I would not be eligible to vote in the state of New Hampshire. And people say, well, that's okay. You should just vote wherever you're registered. But why would I vote in Michigan if I no longer reside there? Why should I be picking the representatives that are going to represent Michigan if I live in New Hampshire? I mean, is that really what we want to start doing, is saying that, if you moved away from New Hampshire recently, you can still influence our representative government? I don't really think that's the way to go. I do think while voting is a right and it should be guaranteed to everybody that isn't disqualified, with that right comes some responsibility. You have to actually go and register to vote. We have same-day registration in New Hampshire. I will never vote to remove same-day registration. Some people say it hurts because people can come in at the last minute and decide to vote, and I happen to think that if you've never before voted in your life, and on the night before Election Day, you run into a candidate that you say, you know what, I'm going to go out and I'm going to register to vote at the polls tomorrow and I'm going to vote, I think that you should have a right to vote. I don't think you should have to plan it 30 days out. I do think there should be some responsibilities that come along with that. I think you should be readily able to prove that you live in New Hampshire permanently. And this is back where we go into the residence versus domicile. In New Hampshire, when you move here, you're supposed to register your car and get a driver's license within 30 days. I doubt anybody checks up on anything. But if you're stopped by the police for speeding or something and you've lived here for 90 days and your license is still from Michigan, I'm sure they could ticket you for it. So we do have certain requirements. If you're going to live in our state, you must register your car here. You must have a driver's license here. I see no reason why when people vote, they can't have similar requirements. You should have to, if you have a New Hampshire driver's license, you are obviously a New Hampshire resident. That should be the easiest way to identify if you're eligible to vote. If you don't have a New Hampshire driver's license, then there should be a good reason why not. If you just don't drive, well, that's one thing. But if your driver's license is still from Michigan, are you actually a New Hampshire resident or are you still a Michigan resident? Because in my opinion, the majority of students who go to wherever to go to school aren't actually moving there. They're just going to school there. When their semester ends, they go back home to wherever they came from. In some cases, students do actually move. I have friends who their kids move to other states to go to school, and then they stay there all summer long, and they have jobs, and they live in an apartment, and they stay there for the duration. I think those people are residents of wherever their college is because they actually live there. But if you come here in September and start school and go home for Christmas and come back, and then at the end of the semester in May, you go back to the other state because that's where you live and that's where your car is registered and that's where your driver's license from and that's where mom and dad's health insurance policy is and that's where your car insurance is and everything else, you should not be voting in New Hampshire. We also could probably apply the same criteria that we apply for in or out-of-state tuition. That kid from Michigan's not going to be eligible for in-state tuition in New Hampshire because he doesn't live here, but yet we're going to let him vote here. As you can see, it's a very complicated, very not easy dilemma to fix. When I get elected this fall, I plan to go back and work on some election law. That's not the committee I serve on, but I do plan to try to help resolve some of the problems that we have, make it so that we're not disenfranchising any voter whatsoever, but that we're ensuring that the people who are voting to elect the representatives for the people of New Hampshire are actually New Hampshire residents. I don't think that's a lot to ask. I think that's a common sense thing that most people say they want. I just think how we get from point A to point B is where we run into a little bit of a dilemma. So, second time today, I'm going to say enough with elections, enough with politics. The other thing I wanted to talk about today, because it is the end of the summer and because it's, we're just coming out of those lazy August days, it's hard to find a whole lot of substantive issues to talk about besides politics. But there is something that's been bugging me, and I've brought it up on the show before, and I noticed it again, and I think about it often when I happen to read somebody say they're visiting from out of town and they make a comment about the quality of our city. I love Manchester. I live in Manchester. I chose Manchester when, I bought my house. I think I'll be in Manchester probably for the majority of the rest of my life. I like the idea of living in a city. I like Manchester. It has a lot of great aspects. But on the same note, there's a lot of parts that I just don't understand why it has to be this way. I hear so many people complain about why there's so much graffiti. Why is there so much graffiti? The graffiti doesn't bother me nearly as much as, say, semi-vacant, semi-burnt out properties do. I've noticed the other day on 2nd Street that there's a house that the fire on the 3rd floor that took out part of the roof that made the building inhabitable has been left in that condition. It has to be 4 years now, many years. And we're not talking this fire was 6 months ago. We're talking this was years ago. And that building sits there vacant with a half burned out, 3rd floor. And I don't understand why. I mean, if the person was, I would think that property owner should have to either tear down the building if it's not repairable, or by now, was there a weight on insurance that you weren't going to fix it? Did you just take the insurance money and you're not going to fix it? What's the holdup? There's another house over on West Street that had a fire, I want to say this winter, but that one's still sitting there all boarded up, and I'm thinking, I don't know, in a day and age where we have so many problems with homeless people and the heroin problem where people are breaking into vacant homes and, using them as places to stay and use their drugs, I don't think it's good for the city to have all these half burned out vacant properties just left sitting there. Besides that, they just drive down the house values in that neighborhood. The houses on West Street, for the most part, are in good shape. They're decent people. They keep their properties decent. But in the middle of it is this half burned out house. Well, how long should that neighbor have to sit there and live next to a half burned out house before the property owner is either required to take it down or repair it? For a city that gets involved in so many things that I don't necessarily think they need to be involved in, we don't seem to get involved in the bigger picture items. I've said it before, if we would just put curbing on some of the streets, you would be amazed at the different attitude property owners would have when their sidewalks look halfway decent. When the city's done their part to make their part look decent, the property owners tend to improve their properties. We saw it happen right on the street I live on when they redid the bridge that goes over the bike path. We were promised curbs. We had to fight for them to put in the curbs. But once the curbs were put in on our side of the street, everybody's property improved. Everybody started caring about what the front yard and the property looked like. I think it's important that the city start paying attention to some of the aesthetic stuff and less about, cracking down on whether or not you have a lime wedge in your hand washing sink during health inspections. That's what we want to promote. We promote, look at all these restaurants that had violations, when what they don't tell you is some of those violations are so minor and so things that people don't care about. Things like if there is a lime wedge in somebody's hand washing sink in a restaurant, they can get dinged for it and say that they have an unsanitary restaurant. I'd like the city to stop pushing regulations on people. I'd like to see them not be so difficult for businesses to work with, and I'd really like to see them worry about what the city looks like in general. I noticed on the corner of South Main Street and Granite Street today, where an old Dunkin' Donuts used to be, there's obviously a new business going in there. They've been working on the building. They took off, the Dunkin' Donuts shingles and things like that. On that corner, there was a little green space where there was some shrubbery, which granted was overgrown because Dunkin' Donuts has been vacant out of that location for a while. But there was some greenery there. This morning I go by and the shrubbery's all gone, which is fine. But it's replaced with that big gray stone gravel that you see like underneath paved roads. That's not pretty. That doesn't do anything to make that intersection more appealing. It's like a cheap way out. And the city probably has no problem with that. Yeah, when Giorgio's went to build their building, I'm sure they were told they had to put in X, Y, and Z shrubbery to make the place look nice. We go after people trying to build new buildings and expand, but yet then we let other people, get away with everything. I'm a big proponent of letting property owners take care of their own property and make the decisions about their own property. Homeowners, in my opinion, should be able to decide if they want a garage or not. They should be able to decide if they want to reside or not. They shouldn't have to go and get permission from the city to do so. But yet, I think that just like with voting, where you have rights, you also have responsibilities. I think it's your responsibility to keep your property at least decent enough so that it's not infecting your neighbors. Once it starts affecting your neighbors, then it's no longer just your rights because now you're infringing on their rights. So if you're watching this and you see things that just could use some love, email them to me because I'd love to compile a list and I'd love to send it over to the aldermen in the various wards and to the mayor's office and say, this is really a mess. This is not helping our city be the gem that it could be. We have our problems. We're a big city. We have more problems than some small towns do. But we have a lot of good things going for us. We put money into parks. We've got a beautiful bike path. We've got a river to thrive off of. Maybe we should put some effort into making some of our neighborhoods a little more appealing so that we can attract more people back to our city. So that's all I have for today. Make sure you tune in next week. I am going to be talking about the primary elections. I will be showing you some recommendations made by different organizations, the NRA, the Republican Liberty Caucus, etc., to help you identify who you might be more aligned with in the Republican primary on the 13th of September. If you have any questions directly about who's running, please, you can reach out to me. You can get me at ManchTalk@gmail.com. I can send you sample ballots. I can, try to direct you to where you can find some information. Take the time this weekend, over the long weekend, do a little research on who's running in your district, who stands for what, who's going to best represent you, who's going to stand up and be a good vote for you, and make sure you plan to come out and vote on the 13th. That's all I've got for today. Enjoy the long weekend, and if you're watching this afterwards, I hope you had a wonderful 3 days. We're gearing up for fall. Let's enjoy whatever summer we can squeeze out. Get out there, enjoy Manchester, enjoy the river, enjoy the bike path, get out to a park. Enjoy the great things that we have in Manchester. See you next week.